you, everyone. Good evening. I'm Keren Yarhi-Milo, and I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs here at Columbia. Thank you all for being here today, and welcome to those joining us via live stream. Our decision to hold this event was prompted by Russia's announcement on September 30th that it would be annexing territory in Ukraine's east and south. Given this confrontational and illegal action, Ukraine's recent counteroffensives and military successes, we at SIPA saw a potentially critical moment in the war. We knew that now was a vital time to reflect on the conflict's evolution and unpack some of the critical developments of the last few days. On Saturday, the key bridge linking Russia to Crimea was destroyed, and this week, Russia retaliated with missile strikes across Ukraine in Kyiv and other cities. Our panel of experts will touch on these recent developments in more details. I believe the rapid escalation of the conflict underscores the value of convening now. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the remarkable work that our faculty have been doing for almost 8 months now. Since the war began, our faculty have been at the forefront of engagement, teaching students and helping them make sense of the conflict and its broader context, but also doing so much more. Our faculty are educating the public at events like this one, and they are writing and disseminating research as well as briefing policymakers at the highest levels. Their collective work around this vital issue represent an academic institution and a policy school in particular at its best. While Columbia SIPA is of course a civilian institution, it is world-renowned for its expertise in security studies at every level, from the nuts and bolts of warfare at the tactical level, all the way up to grand strategy and foreign policy writ large. SIPA and the Saltzman Institute in particular is unique, capable to providing leading commentary and analysis on this war, as well as the state of world politics at large. Our work also honors SIPA's history. The school was established in the aftermath of World War II to help prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. While the scope of our work has expanded since SIPA's inception, this legacy endures. Tonight, we're fortunate to welcome 6 distinguished panelists. I think the most valuable way to use our time tonight is not to talk about these great experts, but to hear from them. So I'm going to strive to keep introductions to a minimum, and we'll say little more about the panelist expertise as each person joins the discussion. Kimberly Martin, Professor Martin, is foremost a Barnard Professor and a member of SIPA's Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies here at SIPA, which I would like to thank for co-sponsoring this event. Elise Giuliano lectures in Columbia's Political Science Department and directs 2 programs for the Harriman Institute, which also has my thanks for serving as an event co-sponsor. Professors Richard Betts, Stephen Biddle, Thomas Christensen, and Peter Clement are all SIPA professors and members of the Saltzman Institute. And the former Ukrainian ambassador to the UN, Valery Kuchensky, who teaches at SIPA, is unfortunately cannot be with us today, and he sends his regrets. I want to acknowledge how noteworthy these Columbia scholars are, how impressive their expertise is, and how lucky we are to be hearing from them tonight. After the event, I strongly encourage you to look up their outstanding commentary and research. I do want to mention, before we begin, that these are some of Columbia's finest scholars, but none of us has a crystal ball. Everyone speaking today is mindful of what we know for certain, what we think we know, and what we don't know. And the discussion will reflect that. Indeed, I think we should all be suspicious of anyone who says they know exactly what's going to happen. It's easy to focus on predictions, but it's more valuable to think about the process of thinking, about the complexities, the reasoning, the arguments, the evidence. I think that's what distinguishes us as academics. All right, so let's dive in. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'll start with you, Steve Biddle, Professor Biddle. So Putin's war in Ukraine is now in its 8th month, and the war has posed a series of surprises. Most observers were shocked by Russia's poor performance in the early weeks, but then the gestalt changed over the summer as the Russians reoriented after their withdrawal from Kyiv, refocused on the Donbass, and found a way to grind their way forward in a series of artillery offensives that pushed the Ukrainians out of Izium, and it's going to be hard for me to, the 4 provinces in Ukraine. Then the tenor of commentary changed again in September with the Ukrainians' lightning counteroffensive that retook about 1,000 square miles of groundwork south of Kyiv. And in recent weeks, the Ukrainians have continued this advance more slowly, while suddenly gaining hundreds of square miles northeast of Kherson. And this is in the country's south. So Dr. Biddle, your research has been groundbreaking when it comes to understanding how militaries operate on the battlefield. You're probably one of the nation's leading experts on military strategies. What's going on with the Russians' military performance? How can a great military power, so many expected to overwhelm the Ukrainians, have failed to do that in the winter, but then seem to recover over the summer, then apparently fold up again in the fall? What's going on? Can you unpack this for us, please?
There's been quite a bit of ping-ponging in this war to date. If all you did was just looked at Russia's weapons or at the size or strength of the Russian state, you'd be forgiven from reaching the kind of assessment that people had reached before the war started, right? That Russia was simply going to destroy by weight of material the Ukrainian military, and we'd then be faced with an insurgency. But one of the central insights in the scholarly study of military effectiveness for the last generation has been the importance of non-military contributors, non-material contributors to combat outcomes. And when you look at the non-material makeup of the Russian military, they have a number of serious handicaps. The scale of corruption in the Russian officer corps is an enormous albatross around their necks. The brutality of Russian enlisted ranks, the lack of emphasis on training and initiative, and the single most important non-material problem the Russians face is the non-material problem in the Kremlin. The quality of strategic guidance in this war from Putin and from Putin's office has been dreadful, and it's systematically put the Russian military in situations that were untenable from which they couldn't possibly succeed. Right? So the war began with an assumption from Putin that the Ukrainians weren't going to fight. And so the initial advance, especially in Kyiv, but elsewhere, was more like a parade than it was like a military operation. Strung out formations, no dismounted infantry, no logistical support. They got cut to ribbons, they had to withdraw. They then decided, as Ukraine started hinting that there was going to be a counteroffensive around Kherson, that they would reinforce on the wrong side of a major water barrier that the Ukrainians have been busily cutting the bridges across, stranding in all likelihood 20 to 30,000 Russian soldiers in a position that's untenable. That reinforcement at Kherson thinned them out at Kharkiv to the point where they couldn't defend there. Massive breakthrough, they lose. So these kinds of strategic decisions would have put any military in a position where it was going to have a great deal of difficulty. I think the appropriate assessment of the Russian military is they're not as strong as their material would suggest, but they're also not as bad at the tactical level as their collapse at Kyiv and their collapse at Kharkiv would have suggested.
So, but the trend lines certainly seem to be favoring Ukraine right now. If Russia's position continues to decay, many are now worried that Putin gambled for resurrection by further escalating the war, perhaps all the way to the use of nuclear weapons. Our panel will turn to that. I know this is a big and important question. We'll get there. But the danger of escalation stems in important degrees from the conventional military prognosis on the ground. So that gets us back into the military, the conventional military. So given all this, Steve, what does the prognosis look like? Where is the military campaign headed? Will there be more twists and turns to come, or is today's Ukraine, momentum sustainable at a conventional level?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest single constraint on Russian military performance is still in office, right?
Yeah.
Putin in the Kremlin hasn't gone away yet.
Right.
On the other side of the conflict, the non-material performance of the Ukrainians has been extraordinary. Tremendously motivated soldiers, very rapid learners, quick adapters to the situations they face, and inspired strategic leadership from Zelensky and the senior military around him. This combination of serious non-material constraints on the Russians and surprisingly strong performance by the non-material components of military power from the Ukrainians has had serious consequences over the last 8 months. The Russians have been bleeding themselves white as a result of these decisions. They have taken casualties, numbers are inevitably soft, of course, but are probably on the order of 30 to 40% of the entire force they committed to this war in February has probably been killed or wounded. They've been expending munitions at a ferocious rate that they're going to have a tremendous deal of difficulty replacing. The consequences of this for the combat motivation of their forces have been poisonous. As the Russians have been frittering away their material advantages, the Ukrainians have been mobilizing. The Ukrainians have been re-equipping. The Ukrainians have been training their forces. In all likelihood, the Russians are now outnumbered in the Ukrainian theater, probably by a factor of 2 to 1 or more. So you look at that situation and you combine it with what's probably the prospective loss of another 20 to 30,000 Russian soldiers marooned on the wrong side of the Dnipro River around Kherson, and you could easily end up in a situation in which the material wherewithal that Russia has left itself with, subject to all the non-material problems they have, is probably going to make it very difficult for them just to hold what they now control, much less anything more. And it's not impossible to imagine, right? My crystal ball is as cloudy as you were suggesting, of course, but it's not impossible to imagine that the Russians could lose Crimea, right? That the Russians could lose all the way back to the 2014 borders. Now, Crimea is a tougher military nut in a lot of ways than anything the Ukrainians have taken on so far, but it's plausible to suggest that the trend lines of declining Russian territorial control are going to continue, subject to 3 big wild cards. Right? The first huge wild card, obviously, is nuclear escalation. There will be a lot more on that to come. It probably wouldn't change the military situation on the ground as much as people might imagine, but it could very well make NATO a co-belligerent in the war. Obvious huge implications if that happens. Second possible huge wild card is if there's a mutiny in the Russian military. The militaries that suffer the kinds of losses that they are suffering on an ongoing basis in an apparently futile cause for which the soldiers have little, if any, commitment, have a tendency to break. The Russians have already encountered serious problems with combat motivation. If that gets bad enough, you could trip over a cliff and the Russian military could refuse to fight. The third big wild card cuts the other direction.
Which is?
Domestic politics in the West, and especially domestic politics in the United States. Support for Ukraine in the Republican Party in the United States is soft now. In the more Trump-oriented parts of the Republican Party, it's very soft and getting softer. If Republicans win the House this fall, or if Trump is reelected in the next presidential cycle.
That's the political considerations in the United States. Thank you. So this is important because all of this is happening against the background of the potential, as you said, factor number 1, nuclear escalation. And indeed, in recent weeks, have revived the long dormant concerns about the possible use of nuclear weapons. President Putin stated explicitly that this was a very real option in the war in Ukraine and added that it was the United States had first used nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For his part, President Biden has likened the current Ukrainian crisis very recently to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is now 60 years, and said that that the world was at risk of Armageddon. And I want to turn to my colleague, Dick Betts. You yourself write in Foreign Affairs, you wrote it recently, that while the odds are very low that sane leaders will actually start a process of trading blows that could end in the destruction of their own countries when it comes to nuclear weapons, very low odds are not good enough. And Dr. Betts, so you're one of the foremost experts on nuclear weapons, deterrence throughout the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, and you've spent a lot of time in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and National Security. Given all this background and expertise, can you help us think through the recent discussion about the risks of nuclear escalation? So maybe first, as a first step, it would be helpful if you could explain some of the terminology that's been thrown around. When people talk about the risk of nuclear weapons, we often think about strategic nuclear weapons, like the ones that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But then when you talk to experts, it's really much less about strategic nuclear weapons that we're concerned about, but more the possibility of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So what is the difference between strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, and how likely do you think that we will escalate, that Putin will use tactical nuclear weapons or strategic ones for that matter?
Well, as the recent Secretary of Defense said, really any nuclear weapon is strategic in the literal sense, but the term, as it's normally used, refers to the long-range weapons that are aimed at targets in the enemy's homeland. And they're carried by intercontinental missiles and long-range bombers. And they're usually the weapons that dominated the concern of theorists who wanted to stabilize deterrence and prevent complete mutual annihilation and unlimited nuclear war. And the Russian and American inventories of these weapons today are in the neighborhood of about 1,500 apiece. And during the Cold War, they were the focus of attention because they were the main currency of arms control agreements and competition. Tactical nuclear weapons are ones that are designed for use on the battlefield to affect the outcomes of regular warfare by targeting military forces, groups of tanks, infantry concentrations or convoys, or things that seem vulnerable to an area destruction weapon. The numbers that both sides have of those are quite different now. The Russians have, by prevalent estimates, almost 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, and the United States about 200. Also, these weapons tend to be, on average, less powerful explosives than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Some are more powerful, whereas strategic nuclear weapons, on average, are significantly higher in explosive power than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, which really probably dominate layman's images of what nuclear war would be like. But the main problem with tactical nuclear weapons is the fear that indecisive exchanges of them in a regular war could lead to gradual increases in use and escalation that ultimately brought in strategic weapons and led to unlimited war.
So let me pick up from where you just left off, because we are talking about the potential for escalation, and so policymakers have to think about what they will do if this actually gets out of control. So one of the major questions that we are facing now, or US policymakers or West, how should the West respond if Russia nevertheless first uses nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? I know it's a loaded question. I know it's a tough question. It's maybe unfair to ask, but that's an important one.
Well, it's fair to say that there is no good answer, no one that gives much confidence of avoiding serious risks. At one extreme, one response would be to essentially do nothing. That is, respond with whatever extra sanctions haven't yet been instituted, increase NATO defense spending, rant and rave about how criminal the Russian action is, et cetera, but that would essentially concede victory to the Russians in this gamble.
Absolutely.
The opposite extreme would be retaliation in kind initially, that is, matching the Russian uses with comparable tactical nuclear strikes by the United States. That's unattractive, not necessarily because of the disparity in numbers of weapons, but because of the danger of uncontrolled escalation, not knowing how a process like that in unprecedented circumstances would work out. The middle option, which isn't good, but arguably less bad than the others, would be for elements of NATO, mainly the United States, to enter the war in Ukraine with conventional air power, mounting conventional airstrikes against Russian forces in Ukraine. And the rationale for not using tactical nuclear weapons in response is a reasonable one, and that is modern technology has made precision targeting of conventional munitions as effective for most military missions as tactical nuclear weapons. There would be an argument that really the nuclear weapons are obsolete.
Right. So these are the three options, and it's not clear right now what in Washington the thinking is. That's a kind of a big question, and hopefully we will never have to really wrestle with that one. Let me now turn to Peter Clement. So recently, sources have revealed that United States intelligence community had a good idea that Russia was planning an invasion of Ukraine, right? We saw the disclosure of intelligence and trying to reveal quite a bit in the lead up to the war. But that it had a hard time using that intelligence to persuade our allies and even Ukraine that an invasion was going to occur, which is interesting. That might have been due to the fact that the invasion represented something of a break from Putin's past actions towards neighboring states, but also the prevailing beliefs that such an invasion would be ill-advised. Like, how do you predict something, or how do you explain a real miscalculation or think about it by the adversary? So, Dr. Clement, you are a historian of Russia by training and spent most of your career at the CIA, most recently as Deputy Assistant Director for Europe and Eurasia. Your time at the CIA has given you expertise and insight into what the Russians and Putin might be thinking. You spent lots of years thinking about it. And last year, we were all baffled as to why Putin decided to invade Ukraine. Why was this break from past behavior? Now, 7 months later on, do we have any more information on why he thought the invasion was a good idea or would be successful?
Sure. Thanks, Keren. Is my mic on? We're okay? I'm not good with mics, I've discovered.
I don't think your mic is working. Is it?
Okay. Is that better?
Now it's
Yeah.
Okay, so great question. As you noted, the intelligence community actually did a pretty good job on predicting, in my view, the fact that this invasion was likely to occur. From my vantage point, as a person who reads all of Putin's speeches, the decisive moment for me was July 12th, 2021. Putin wrote this 20-page treatise entitled The Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And I was completely blown away by its direct candor. And in my view, and I wish Professor Jervis was here, this was more than a little signal. It was a rather large signal. When someone says that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, they are one whole, tells you next that the Ukrainians are basically managed by external forces, and then talks about NATO infrastructure and NATO advisors, and then argues that in fact Ukraine has never really existed as a historical entity. At that point, I began to seriously believe, I think as the head of a major power, for him to say this must mean he seriously is thinking about taking some direct action. So I guess my short answer is I think Putin basically told us what he thought about Ukraine, and it should have not been too much of a surprise that he actually acted on it.
And so we know also from his own statement, and this is like us trying to figure out his decision-making process, the rationality, and other members in this panel also wrote about it. But we know from his own assessment that the impressions of observers that Putin is somewhat obsessed with Russia's history, right? And that's what you also refer to. A history that includes also major miscalculations and debacles, right? This 1979 decision, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, is a case in point. They went in, and that was their Vietnam in many ways. Or when they placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. That turned out to be also some sort of a miscalculation in 1962. So one of the kind of the interesting puzzles that come up with this in thinking about Putin, if he reads history, if he thinks about Soviet history, Russia's history, if he's a student of Russian history, how come that he, failed to see the lessons of past failures? How much those analogies figured into his assessment? Why did he ignore them, and so on? So do you think this his decision to invade Ukraine suffered from the same kind of biases, the same kind of miscalculations that past leaders, that his predecessors faced or had issues with?
Short answer is I absolutely do believe that he made very similar flawed decisions, specifically in the case of the Soviet decision to pursue a war of choice in Afghanistan. And when you read the record, and this is fascinating as a historian type, we actually have the minutes in great detail of Soviet Politburo meetings where they discussed whether or not they should go into Afghanistan. Interestingly, 9 months before they invaded, at a 2-day Politburo session, the Politburo all agreed this was a terrible idea. Andropov, the head of the KGB, actually argued that if we were to go in there, we'd be facing a country that's dominated by the Islamic faith, a country with a horrible economy, and a country where most of the people are illiterate. And for us to actually go in and invade, we would have to suppress the ongoing protest and revolution with the force of our bayonets. And quote, this is inadmissible to us. 9 months later, the very same Andropov argues in complete defiance of the reality, the correct reality, he said in March, says, for ideological reasons, we cannot allow the regime in Afghanistan to fall somehow and tilt to the west. We must maintain the correlation of forces.
The correlation of forces.
So in my view, the analog with Putin here is he's so detached from the reality of modern day Ukraine. It's been independent for 30 years. They do have a sense of a distinct national identity, and it's not really Russian. For him to believe that they are so kindred spirits that we could go in and invade, and they would basically, there'd be very modest resistance. It's shocking. But I think there's a direct parallel there with this decision that the Soviets undertook in Afghanistan.
And the pandemic and his isolation, do you think it?
Of course. Probably a lot of other factors. I do think Putin is the ultimate decision maker. I do think he was isolated. He had access to far fewer advisors than normal. And I also think he's a very smart politician, because the one thing he did 3 days before the invasion, he convened a meeting of the entire Security Council. He presided over the meeting. He's at a table by himself. The advisors are spread out in chairs, all of them. And he talks about the need to discuss the situation in Ukraine. What should we do? And they all, to a person, agreed we must take an action in Ukraine. Smart politician, if things go bad, gee, this was a group decision. This wasn't just my idea. Take note, folks. If you want to be a good politician, spread the blame around and don't be the solo actor here.
Unbelievable. Okay. Let's move on to Kim Martin. So to try to stem the tide of Russians' losses, Putin announced a partial mobilization in Russia to bolster the Russian army. As a result, fighting-age Russian men are fleeing the countries in droves, and we've witnessed an outburst of forbidden criticism of the war inside Russia. Dr. Martin, you have extraordinary expertise on Russia, which has led you to testifying before Congress multiple times on Russia-related issues. And you give us, and repeatedly giving us, phenomenal insight into the Russians' inner workings as the war reaches a turning point. So let me ask you this at this point of the war. Based on your expertise in Russian security and foreign policy issues, what's your assessment? Has this crisis damaged Putin's political positions at home? And if so, how big is a potential threat to his rule? Might he end up ousted like Khrushchev?
Well, thank you, Karen. That's a complicated question.
It is.
I'm happy to say some additional things in the Q&A afterwards. But the basic difference between the Soviet system under Khrushchev and the system that we have in Russia under Putin is that there was a communist party when Khrushchev was in power that had a Politburo. And so there was a bureaucracy that was used to making decisions together that could then make a decision that it was time for Khrushchev to go. The Russian system is based on patronage. It's basically based on a bunch of individuals who owe their entire well-being to Putin. They are competitors with each other. And so Putin is who keeps them in power, who gives them their wealth. And if we were to imagine some kind of overturn in power, what we'd have to imagine is that these people at the top would somehow all trust each other enough to come to some kind of a joint decision when we know that the FSB, the security services, the intelligence services, are watching everybody all the time. And you'd have to be afraid that you would be the one who was set out as a traitor. They'd have to, with these people they don't trust, they'd have to get together and decide how they would make it happen, what the procedure would be, what time they would use to act, and then they would have to decide who the replacement was. And there's no obvious replacement. So, I mean, people can suffer a lot under Putin in terms of lost economic well-being. But it's not like they can go somewhere else to regain it. They couldn't make money in the West because they didn't get their money. They didn't get their position because of what they did. They got their money and position because of what Putin gave them. And so the situation that we're in right now probably isn't negative enough for them to be willing to take the risk to try to do that kind of overturn in power. But I could imagine that if Putin decided to use a nuclear weapon, and the result was that Russia was so incredibly isolated on the international stage that nobody wanted to be its friend, its economy at that point would probably just about collapse. At that point, people might decide that it was time that they had to do something. And the one thing that would make us a little bit hopeful that maybe it wouldn't be complete instability is that we know in the post-Stalin transition, there was a group of 6 or 7 people who had been together for many, many years under Stalin. And we know this because of the work of Sheila Fitzpatrick, a really top historian who's looked at the Stalin archives, who managed to think to themselves about what would happen if Stalin were to pass away. Now, Putin's been in power for 22 years. So maybe there is this cabal of inner circle people that have been thinking about this for a while and we just haven't seen it. But if that doesn't happen, I worry that if there was any attempt to change power away from Putin, what we'd see is a mafia-style war that would just bring a lot of instability to the country.
So let me ask you this. Going back to the beginning, I think we're all in the business of dropping. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. There were, I remember being here on the stage, thinking at the beginning of the war, what's the rationale for, what is he thinking? What really motivated him? Trying to get into the psychology. And sometimes we're just looking and hearing what the kind of official rationale that comes out. And we wonder, is this really true or is there something else? And so one of the arguments, and unfortunately, I mean, we saw this coming from Putin, we saw this also coming from members of this, the academy in the West, political scientists, and saying that it was NATO's expansion that led to this war, and this was more of a defensive war, and this was a debate. There was a debate among political scientists, and I was wondering, right now, thinking about where we are in the war, reflecting on what we know about the earlier stages and his thinking, and how his thinking has evolved and the rationale for the war has evolved. So what can you tell us about this argument, about NATO's expansion?
Yeah.
Is it really at Putin's, the kind of the roots of Putin's action, or is there something else? Peter alluded to something else, but can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So Putin has said that NATO enlargement was the reason that he had to take action, because Ukraine was about to fall into NATO's clutches, and that would be a terrible threat to Russia. We can't know what's actually going on inside Putin's head, obviously. But all the evidence we have is that NATO expansion was not really seen as something that was a deep military threat in Russia. What evidence do we have of that? Well, NATO enlargement has been going on the entire time that Putin has been in office. And yet the entire time that Putin has been in office, over 22 years, we haven't seen a consistent hatred of the West or expressions of fear of the West. Early on, he seemed to somebody that was actually supportive of a Russian relationship with the West. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if Russia had actually been afraid of NATO enlargement, we would have expected that as every new country joined NATO, that there would have been some kind of a physical reaction on Russia's part. There certainly was a rhetorical reaction. Russians were very unhappy about this, but there was not a military buildup to the west of Russian borders that we would expect if they thought that a military threat was coming from the west. And when did we actually see the buildup first start happening? It was in 2014, just before they did their initial move into Ukraine. So that's another piece of evidence. And I would say the third piece of evidence is what we've had most recently. There wasn't actually much of a Russian reaction to the announcement that Finland and Sweden are going to join NATO. If Russia was militarily frightened by NATO enlargement, that border with Finland is gigantic. And that should have been something that was just outrageously frightening to Russia. And we would have expected some kind of a real military reaction, and we didn't get one. So my guess is that it's rhetoric rather than reality, but who knows what goes on inside Putin's head.
Obviously, this is the most difficult question to answer. I know, Peter, that you wanted to jump in.
Sure. Just in the spirit of an alternative viewpoint, perhaps because in my class today, I had them read Mearsheimer and Professor McFall.
Let's just, John Mearsheimer, Professor of Political Science, University of Chicago, who initially kind of big proponent of the thesis that it was definitely, in his mind, he's very confident in his assessment that it was NATO's expansion that led Putin. Yes.
So, I mean, I totally share. This is an incredibly complex issue. As the students on my class will tell you, there is no perfect answer to this. To me, it's one of the hardest questions that we wrestle with, but just to offer a perspective on the other side. So I would argue, some have argued, that one of the reasons Putin was a little more restrained between 2000, when he became president, and say 2008, was A, the Russian military was still in early rebuild mode. There was a lot of modernization that still had to be done. They were not yet a strong power. The NATO red line issue, for me, occurred in March of 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, when NATO said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. 3 months later, the Russians invade Georgia. And to me, that's a fairly strong signal that this whole discussion of NATO with Mr. Saakashvili was a pretty big red line. We saw this again in 2014, but the difference in 2014 was we're going to have a much more built up, modern equipped, and also a very easy victory in Crimea. How hard was it where the Black Sea Fleet is based, and there are many, many ethnic Russians to take over Crimea. The eastern provinces, more difficult, but it gave them a hook to say there's an ongoing territorial conflict, therefore you can't be considering them for NATO membership, because Crimea, by the way, is part of Russia now, so that can't be a territorial conflict.
I can't let Peter have the last word on it.
Here you go. I agree. You cannot let him have the last word.
I don't want to be
ahead.
between them.
Just separate if it gets to.
So the 2008 Bucharest statement didn't come out of nowhere. In 2007, Putin gave an amazing speech at the Munich Security Conference that really set the course for everything that would happen afterwards, where he surprised the entire Western audience by describing NATO and the United States as being incredibly threatening. That preceded, it didn't follow the Bucharest statement that came out in 2008. And what actually happened in Bucharest in 2008 is that Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Advisor of the United States at that time.
Secretary of State. Yeah.
Secretary of State,
Secretary
sorry.
of State, yeah.
My boss.
Really wanted NATO to say that Georgia and Ukraine would be members. And so she pushed it on everybody. But the Europeans pushed back. And that statement that Ukraine and Georgia would be NATO members was not followed by any action. Normally, if you're going to join NATO, you give them a membership action plan. And in fact, the European diplomats at that time were saying under their breath, Georgia and Ukraine will become NATO members when hell freezes over. And even if Putin wasn't reading the newspapers himself, he certainly had intelligence people who were reading the newspapers and who understood that this was the conflict happening in the West. And so it takes a huge stretch of the imagination to think that Putin really believed that Ukraine and Georgia were about to become NATO members in 2008. And in fact, we've seen that they haven't become NATO members since, even though Zelensky now says he wants a fast-track action. Ain't gonna happen.
No, she got the last word, but this is just to give you a glimpse of how brown bag lunches sound like and look like at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies.
True.
And this is nothing. This can go for hours, not just between
I want in too.
believe me, you didn't have to say that. I knew you would want, but we have to move on. I just want to say why this is important. It's not just about trying to get into the psychology. Obviously, there are huge implications that ride on this question, right? Implications for how do we think about assurances versus further deterrence? How do we think about the future of NATO and further? So there are big policy questions that ride on this kind of question of what really went in his, what were his assessments and where and how much this was a reaction to NATO. And we can pick up on this in Q&A, and we're going to leave time for Q&A, do not worry. There's plenty of time. All right, there is another angle in this war we haven't talked about, and this is the China question and the China angle. So Russia-China relationship has been tested by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with Putin saying in September at a summit in Uzbekistan that he understood that China had questions and concerns, quote, about the war in Ukraine. Xi Jinping, for his part, failed to mention the Ukraine war in his remarks at the summit. And this may signal some strains between the two authoritarian leaders in the face of Russian losses in Ukraine. We're really fortunate to have with us Dr. Tom Christensen, one of our leading specialists on China's foreign relations, and his expertise coming not just from his academic research, but also from his time as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with responsibility for relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. I know that, Tom, you've been really preoccupied in the past couple of months thinking about the situation and looking at it and analyzing it. If you can take us a little bit into what's happening in the minds of Xi Jinping at the moment. There are domestic factors, there are foreign policy factors, there are all these calculations right now that he has to manage and figure out how to respond, how to talk about Russia, how to think about Ukraine. What are some of the salient ones?
Thanks a lot, Karen. I think that at the most basic level, Putin exploited his relationship with Xi Jinping by having a very public statement about the limitless nature of the partnership between the PRC and Russia, and then 3 weeks later launching a war that really runs against Beijing's interests. Right. Now, Xi Jinping and Putin are very close. Xi Jinping has often called Putin his best friend, and then you have that big public statement. Right. So it's very difficult for the PRC to condemn the Russian invasion, to criticize the Russian invasion, and do anything but stand beside Russia to protect Russia from criticism from others, and to parrot a lot of the rhetoric out of Moscow about NATO expansion, how the US is responsible, and how the US and NATO giving weapons to the Ukrainians is adding gasoline to the fire. So this reaction is very much wrapped up in the fact that Xi Jinping and Putin are have very common interests domestically and internationally in opposing what they see as the United States and its allies' efforts to spread color revolutions around the world and destabilize authoritarian states and spread democracy. So Xi will not move too hard against Putin, but the problem is that this failure to condemn the invasion has really hurt China's foreign policy at a fundamental level. China's reputation around the world, particularly with advanced economies, has gone from bad to very, very bad in the process. In Europe in particular, China was making inroads in Eastern Europe. That has pretty much collapsed, that initiative. And now Xi Jinping has this dilemma, and this is the real dilemma for China, that on the one hand, he doesn't want Putin to fall. He doesn't want to collapse the regime. That would be really bad for the Chinese Communist Party and bad for him individually because he has latched himself to Putin. But at the same time, he doesn't want to violate the international sanctions, the multilateral sanctions that the Biden administration has very impressively put together. And they have threatened second countries, right? These are secondary sanctions, that if they supply strategic materials, finance, airplane parts or aircraft, semiconductors to Russia, they will be sanctioned very heavily.
Yes.
And despite China's effort to become much more independent of the United States, the Europeans and others in key industries, they are not independent. They're very dependent on those industries. So Xi Jinping has to walk this tightrope of diplomatically supporting Russia, sometimes indirectly, sometimes directly, and not violating those sanctions. And that's going to be a tension moving forward as the sanctions have more bite. And Putin looks like he's in more trouble at home. The temptation for the Chinese Communist Party and for Xi Jinping in particular to help him out, to try to prop him up by taking actions that put the Chinese economy at risk will grow. And then at an abstract level, it's been a bad thing for China because I think it has really intensified the view in the United States in particular, but also among US allies, that international politics now in the post-Cold War era is really about authoritarianism versus democracy.
Yes.
And that's not a good thing for China that's trying to keep US alliances off balance in its own region. And it's not a good thing for mainland China in dealing with Taiwan, because a lot of people are drawing direct connections to Taiwan, saying there's a democracy that's threatened by an authority, so we need to double down on our support of Taiwan. And the last thing is, it really undercuts the mainland's argument about Taiwan, which is it's all about sovereignty. Now, when Chinese diplomats say that now, it's very easy for other diplomats to say, if sovereignty is so important, what about Ukraine? What about the eastern provinces of Ukraine that just went through a referendum to annex them into Russia? Why aren't you criticizing those things if you're so
But that will not be
loyal
the first
to
time we have double standard in world politics. But tell me, on the issue of China, do you see any red lines? And if he escalates to nuclear weapons, do you see that point the Chinese are saying that's it?
I don't know what "that's it" means.
I mean we are turning again.
I don't think they will say Putin has to go and the regime has to come down. That's really not their style. They would be appalled by this. It runs against their own doctrines about whether nuclear weapons should be used against non-nuclear states, et cetera. And they would be worried about escalation. But again, I think for them, a lot of this is wrapped up in their concerns about their domestic economy and this very impressive sanctions regime that was put in place, and about cross-strait relations and the growing likelihood of a conflict across the
That's
strait.
what I want to get to. So because this is a critical, and that kind of shows the complexity of the situation in the world we are in at the moment. Because the war in Ukraine has potential implications to other major crises and other areas of conflict, and Taiwan is definitely is a potential one. And if you are talking to people in Washington these days, there are almost two concerns, right? There's the concerns about what Putin will do, but there's almost an equal concern about what are the Chinese learning about, what are they observing, what are they inferring from what's happening in this war about their conflict with Taiwan. Is this an opportunity? Is this showing them that there have maybe a window or not? Or are they more deterred or less deterred? It's really hard to kind of think about those calculations. And if there's somebody that can help us think through this complexity of those inferences that they're drawing, is you, Tom. So how should we think about, if you're trying to put yourself from Xi's perspective, how is he analyzing the Ukraine war in terms of his thinking about next steps in Taiwan?
Yeah, it's a bit of guesswork. You know, this is a hard intelligence target.
It's a very, very
so you know, you have to do some guessing. But my strong sense is that the war in Ukraine and how it had, the war on Ukraine and the war, how it has played out will likely lead to some degree of caution in Beijing. I don't think they'll see it as an opportunity to attack Taiwan. I think instead they will say a couple of things. They'll say, we really need to make sure that if we do attack Taiwan, that we can achieve whatever our military promises as civilian leadership that it can achieve. And I think there's got to be some concern in Xi's inner circles that Putin was given false promises and analysis by his own military about what they could achieve in a hurry. I think that there's got to be some concern that there's a demonstrated capability of an asymmetric defense against a stronger military during an invasion in particular, and that weapons brought in from the outside could be used against a superior force very effectively. And I think that might lead in an invasion scenario for the mainland to think that it needs to be able to achieve victory quickly. But the problem with that is it may be more necessary, but it may be proven to be more difficult because of what happened. So unfortunately for Taiwan and for people like myself who care about Taiwan, the mainland China has other military options. And we saw some of those military options in August in what was the fourth Taiwan Straits crisis. And they could blockade the island. And that's a much harder thing for Taiwan or the United States to respond effectively to, but it's slow and it's grinding, and the prospect of large-scale sanctions for the United States and the allies would probably give some pause to even wanting to do that. So that's all on the side of deterrence and saying deterrence may have been enhanced, but there's one key thing, and I referred to it earlier and I'll return to it to finish my answer. And that is deterrence really has two elements. And I have a foreign affairs piece coming out tomorrow morning, right along these lines.
Great.
Tomorrow morning. It has two elements. It has the credibility of threat that you can punish the attacker, and an assurance to the attacker that if they don't attack, they won't get hurt. And the problem with the Ukraine war is this narrative of authoritarianism versus democracy and the intensification of support for Taiwan in the United States and in other countries in the region, not many, but some, has to worry the mainland about the trend lines, that maybe there'll be an upgrade in the political relationship, there'll be a clarification of the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. There are politicians talking about recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign state. That would undercut deterrence, in my opinion. So it's a double-edged sword, and if people want to see my full argument and my colleagues' full argument, tomorrow morning online at Fargo.
That's good. That's good. And obviously, this is not an event on U.S. and China-Taiwan relations, but then there is the question of what is Taiwan inferring from everything that is happening now, right? And that's
the invasion of Ukraine intensified all of these things all at once. It was incredibly consequential for cross-strait relations. And you hear U.S. politicians saying things that U.S. politicians weren't saying 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And there was a reason they weren't saying them. I don't think they're good things. There was a reason.
You just, so just people understand what they were saying.
Well, I mean,
we're not saying that
there have been
just so everybody's on the same page.
There's been a certain lack of discipline in the Biden administration about how they discuss cross-strait relations. The proper formulas are very complicated, and you have to be very studious about them. It's almost like theology. Strategic ambiguity has lots of elements, and it's like a theology. And when you slip from it, people notice, right? So there's that element, and then there's the competitive political element where you have a lot of people, particularly in the Republican Party, but some Democrats as well, saying we should recognize Taiwan, or we should clarify our commitment to Taiwan and defend it under all circumstances, or Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Pompeo saying we should recognize Taiwan, former National Security Advisor John Bolton saying we should station large numbers of U.S. forces on Taiwan. And all of these things would be fundamental changes.
And so that steers this conflict, and that's part of the complexity of the situation. Thank you, Tom. I want to move now to the Ukrainians and what's happening in Ukraine. And, you know, we at the policy school can teach and we can write a lot about leadership, and then you see leadership in action, and that you see this with Zelensky. And really, this is one of the most remarkable things that we've seen this war is the resolve, the determination, the courage, the creativity of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leaderships and President Zelensky. And so, Dr. Giuliani, thank you for being with us today on this. You're a leading voice in research on Russian and Ukrainian politics and have conducted path-breaking field work in Kharkiv, which is very, very rare and great work that you've done there. Can you tell us about the role that Zelensky's public diplomacy has played in the war effort with respect not just to the morale of the Ukrainian people, which, as Steve said before, very, very important to understanding the success on the battlefield, but also the research, the search for international allies. And he's been doing this very effectively. Can you say more about that, please?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, so this is a war in which external funding, external financing, and external weapons are critical to victory. With finance and with arms, Ukraine can defeat Russia. We don't know at what cost, but external financing and weapons are critical. Therefore, when we see Zelensky give speeches around the world to parliaments, for example, to the Knesset in Israel, to the US Congress, to the UK, we shouldn't just think of this as PR for PR's sake, but as a central component of fighting the war. Zelensky, fortunately, has a talent for tailoring his message to his audience and was able to pick up on particular episodes in the history of these places while he was giving these kinds of talks. Similarly, his endless meetings with foreign opinion leaders, including one of our own colleagues who traveled to Kyiv to meet with him, is part of this effort. So public diplomacy for Zelensky constitutes a critical strategic purpose. Now, also, you referenced the Ukrainian population, and Stephen Biddle also made a contrast between the Russian population and the Ukrainian population, or the armies. But in addition to that sharp contrast, the Ukrainian population is highly mobilized in this effort. They're fighting, they're volunteering, they're cooking, they're doing, they're repairing, they're reporting. I could go on. And he also delivers daily speeches, near daily speeches to the Ukrainian population. And he's able to speak to them in a way that resonates with their patriotism and at a very emotional level. How does he do this? He meets with them, he listens to them, and then he crafts messages in which he tells them, you are strong, you are brave. He, in a way, tells them how they should be thinking about their response to the horror and the stress that they're under. And when missiles are raining down on your home, and when you're watching children around you be turned into orphans, it's a quite stressful situation. So given the importance of civilian mobilization to the war, we really should recognize that Zelensky's oratorical skills are critical and form a strategic purpose in inspiring his own population.
So, yeah, it's really been remarkable to see what he's been able to do with how effective it is. Let me ask you a basic question about what Putin has now done. We know that the referendum in these provinces was sham. They were forced to vote yes. So that begs the question, though. They're not with him. They're going to continue to resist. Why, given this huge cost of annexation, why did Putin want to annex those territories? What is he really gaining because he's really not in control of those regions.
So this is a big question, and there are multiple audiences for the annexation of these 4 regions. So I will just confine my comments to 2 of those audiences, a domestic audience within Russia and then the international audience. So the war has been going so badly for Russia, as we know, that Putin and the Kremlin decided they needed to begin a draft, which they call mobilization.
Right.
And they knew that this would not be popular. It's incredibly unpopular, and I'm sure the audience has heard about avoidance of the draft by Russians. So Putin, in a way, right before the draft, wanted to create maybe a repeat of the surge in popularity that he experienced when he annexed Crimea.
Right.
But these 4 regions of Ukraine are very different from Crimea for Russians, and I could talk more about why there is more support for Crimea among Russians in the Q&A than for these 4 Ukrainian regions. But also the referenda, the sham referenda, are supposed to show Russians that, hey, look, 98% of the population in these areas want to join Russia. And that supports Putin's argument or justification for the war that he's been making from the very beginning, which is that this population in Ukraine are not really Ukrainians, especially Russian speakers in the east and south. They are actually Russians, and we need to protect them from Ukraine's Nazi government. So it's ludicrous, but some Russians, fall for this. The second audience that I want to mention is an international one. The fake legalism of the referenda is designed to confuse people about where the sympathies of the political opinions of people in the East and South lie. Now, it may seem obvious to us, but there are various audiences out there for these messages. There are sympathetic governments in the global South, like Venezuela, in Africa, so on, in Eastern Europe. There are people, political leaders or movements on the far right and the far left in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, and in the US. Of course, Tucker Carlson springs to mind, maybe Elon Musk springs to mind. But there also have been, in a different way, mainstream voices here, authoritative voices, some of them publishing in the New York Times throughout the war, that have made the argument that maybe, Ukraine, especially earlier when Ukraine wasn't doing as well, that maybe Ukraine's going to have to give up on the East and South and just cede that territory to Russia. And then the fact that, especially when, analysts, and I hear this again and again, bring in this fact of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, or the very small minority of Ukrainians who have an ethnic Russian identity, or the complexity of that there were pro-Russians in 2014 who took advantage of the Maidan and the upheaval there to support Russia. This complexity really, tends to muddle the situation, and the Kremlin is trying to just kind of create a sense of inevitability about the idea that Ukrainians there want to be part of Russia.
So if we stay for a second with really thinking about the Ukrainians living in these annexed regions, in those occupied regions, what are the conditions under which they can really continue to resist? And if you can just unpack this a little bit for us, and then one last question, and we turn it to Q&A.
So yes, I'll try to be brief because this is my area of research, and it's quite complicated.
It's tough.
But we have to be careful, I think, to not, this is making the same point, we don't want to do Putin's work for him, right? We don't want to make assumptions about the political loyalties of people there. We don't, we keep using this term pro-Russian, but we don't interrogate what it means. But actually, when we throw that term around, there were, especially after 2014, Ukrainians who were pro-Russian. Did it mean they wanted to join Russia? Not necessarily. It meant often that they were culturally sympathetic or wanted to engage in trade or had problems with the central government in Ukraine. So it's critical to kind of understand this fact that Russian-speaking Ukrainians are not pro-Russian, and language doesn't determine political sympathies in Ukraine. And part of that is what I think Peter already mentioned, that national identity in Ukraine has grown stronger since 1991 when Ukraine became an independent state. And national identity in Ukraine is a civic, it's a civic identity, and Zelensky really has been emphasizing the civicness rather than the ethnic basis of the national identity there. And so Americans with their primarily civic identity, should be attuned to this kind of point, but Americans often make assumptions about European countries,
Of course.
and make assumptions about the authenticity of a country based on whether how old and ancient its culture is, and
Yep.
the ethnic basis of its culture. And you know, in fact, this is Putin's claim about
Yep.
Ukraine. Of course, he gets the history wrong, but Zelensky rejects that framing. He doesn't play on Putin's ideological or intellectual playing field at
Yep.
all. Right? So the lived experiences of East Ukrainians reject that framing. So I think, you know, just to emphasize the point that there are very few pro-Russian Ukrainians in the East and South, and so I think that the guerrilla movement will be going strong
We will be going
for some
strong.
time to come.
So that brings us to the last question, and then we will open it up, which the guerrilla resistance is going to, you know, in your assessment, going to grow strong. That brings us back to the United States and the policies and the dilemma in the West. And one of the key questions for US, for Western policymakers right now, is how do we think about, especially thinking about the last stage of what we've seen happening in the battlefield with the terrorist attacks and so on. Especially if we think about the potential risk of escalation to nuclear weapons. There is the question of how do we think about arming Ukraine? And this is a very delicate and tough question. It's a very complicated question, and students in international relations have, you know, studied this in theory for many, many years. How do we think about aiding allies who are in war? What are the different considerations? Are there differences between giving offensive weapons versus defensive weapons? Are there differences between arming for the ally to win a war versus arming an ally in order to really get to a good position to negotiate an agreement? These are very complex, complicated questions, and a lot is riding. And this is a question for the entire panel, thinking about the complexity of the questions and really the next move from the United States and the West. How should we think about it? What are the different factors? Can you unpack this, and then we'll turn to Q&A. The floor is yours. You can decide. Jump in. Okay, Steve, and then
next to you,
okay, Steve, and then I know that Dick Betts will want to say something about, and Kim Martin. Here you go. Okay, Steve.
So the escalation debate since February has tended to revolve around specific weapon types, right? Do we provide airplanes to the Ukrainians or not? Now, do we provide ATACMS, a longer-range missile, to the Ukrainians or not? And there's an understandable reason for that. For example, providing the Ukrainians with ATACMS gives them the ability to strike targets within Russia at considerably greater depths than they can do now.
Yep.
That might embarrass Putin politically, that would give him an incentive to escalate as a way of rescuing his reputation. So there are some reasons why you might worry about particular weapons. But ultimately, the logic of escalation turns on the fundamental problem of choosing between a status quo in which you're going to lose a stake and the option of escalating the level of violence to retain the stake.
Yep.
And that's only loosely related to particular weapon types. If the underlying conventional dynamic of this war is that Putin is losing ground and is unlikely to be able to stop losing ground, then he faces the same ultimate dilemma of, do I tolerate that status quo and just continue to lose square miles?
Right.
Or do I do something or another to try and change the picture? In all likelihood, the recent attacks on Ukrainian economic and energy infrastructures
that would be
related
right,
to
right.
that. So unless, to put it as starkly as I can, unless we are prepared to compel Ukraine to lose the war,
okay,
unless we are prepared to give Putin the stake that he seeks, there will be some incentive for Putin to escalate rather than accept a circumstance that otherwise will leave him without a stake that he clearly values. There are some who argue, in fact, that in order to avert the prospect of nuclear escalation, the United States should compel the Ukrainians to accept some or another variant on the concept of defeat, give Putin what he's after. The problem is, from an American perspective in particular, there are dilemmas the dilemma creates problems on both sides of that choice. Potentially, we could argue that if we hand Ukraine over to Putin,
Yeah.
We avert the likelihood of a near-term nuclear escalation, but we then reward nuclear saber rattling by somebody who started a war and then used nuclear weapons as a way to gain his ill-begotten conquests. And that just creates an incentive for further aggression down the road by the same aggressor, much less
or different aggressors.
Or
different aggressors.
Who knows? I mean, all sorts of opportunities for aggressors. So, I mean, this is not an unambiguous, straightforward choice between let's do the safe things for America first and hand the Ukrainians over to Putin. There's a downside to that option, too. What the Biden administration has been trying to do is to square this circle by essentially rolling back the Russian gains in slow motion rather than all of a sudden, in the hope that this will give Putin and the people around him time to reevaluate the bargain that they've bought themselves into, and perhaps persuade Putin, if he's persuadable, that maybe accepting a lot less than he wants is better than the end of the escalatory ladder, which is horrific for everyone.
But it's a constant question, right? Because things are evolving on the battlefield. And so therefore, that question comes up again and again every day. And we might find ourselves thinking differently.
This is an extremely dynamic process.
Right. That's right.
And the Biden approach of letting things go slow so as to provide maximum opportunity for the Russians to do the right thing can be overturned at any moment. If there is a mutiny in the Russian army tomorrow morning, win slow is not going to be what's going to happen.
Thank you so much for this. Dick Betts and then Kim Martin.
Yeah, I'd say three things. First, it would be a mistake, I think, to believe that we have the skill or finesse to carefully orchestrate how our role in supplying and affecting things can control the situation. Secondly, if we did do that in a way in order to purposely maintain a stalemate that didn't enable the Ukrainians to do better, that would be immoral, because an indefinite stalemate, just as a meat grinder, which kills lots of people for no good purpose. But the third point would be that while I favor giving the Ukrainians as much useful military aid as possible, it should be strictly conditional with a clear stipulation that you get this as long as you meet American demands, such as maintaining the sort of Russian sanctuaries within Russian territory, not carrying the war into Russian territory, things that for the Ukrainians might be hard to accept because of knowledge about what advantages they could get if they had more freedom. So I think conditionality modifies the painful dilemma that the better the news gets on the battlefield for Ukraine, the greater the danger becomes of Putin getting desperate and raising the ante.
Kim.
Yeah, I just want to say that the Russian narrative on this war is that it's a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And I think it's important that we don't fall into that kind of thinking. And it's not helped by some of the statements that come out of high-level people who talk about, wanting to destroy Russia's capability in the future. But for somebody who has spent some time in Ukraine and who has Ukrainian colleagues, as is true for many of us on the panel, there are a lot of people in Ukraine who honestly want to make Ukraine a Western democracy, who honestly want to establish a system that has human rights and that is uncorrupt, that is moving as much as they can towards the West. And these people were attacked for no reason, with no provocation, by somebody who is now trying to use nuclear threats to get them to give in. And I think we have an ethical obligation to continue to provide Ukraine with assistance as long as Ukraine wants to keep on fighting. I don't think it's our role to decide whether Ukraine is going to become a meat grinder or not. We can certainly give advice about the consequences of various things. It's a decision for the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government to make, because it's not a proxy war. We are there to defend sovereignty by somebody who was attacked for no reason whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else on the panel wants to comment on this? Okay, so we've given you a little bit of a kind of a glimpse as to what are the questions that when we sit together and talk about this and try to analyze this from different perspectives, those are the questions that keep coming up. But there are many more and this is again a complex situation. So now I will turn to the audience and give you the opportunity to ask the panelists questions that you have. There are 2 microphones, and if you can just form a line next to the microphones, and then we'll take one from each side.
Can people identify themselves?
Yes, that would be great if you can state your name and what program or school you're in. And I'll start with you here.
Hi, my name is Emilia. I'm an NSCR program, and I'm from Kyiv myself. Thank you very much for a great discussion, very informative. And as you know, Kyiv again was attacked just on Monday. And it's been going on since the 24th, but original war started in 2014. I just want to make clear because a lot of people forget that war started in 2014, not on the 24th of February. And my question is, given that this huge amount of evidence of Russian terrorist attacks on peaceful cities, on playgrounds, hospitals, Olenivka bombardment, Mariupol destroyed, completely obliterated, the blooming city. And all those in military infrastructures, Russia labels the playground where I used to play as a child, a military infrastructure. What prevents the US and other countries in the world recognize Russia as a terrorist state? Because I believe there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that prove that everything Russia used on Ukraine, on civilians, on civilian infrastructure, definitely proves that they are a terrorist state. And so my question is, what prevents the US and the US Congress and representatives from officially stating that this is a terrorist state and this is going to have a great impact on Ukraine, because the less countries continue to trade with Russia or seek diplomatic resolutions with Russia, the faster we're going to win. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. And I'm very sorry to hear. I know that you're there, and I know how difficult it has been. And this is a question that I will, Kim, please.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very difficult question, and I share Keren's view that I'm very, very sorry that you have really experienced this tragedy. I think when it comes to international diplomacy, words matter. And I think what people are deciding to do when it comes to these Russian war crimes is to call them war crimes rather than terrorism. And I think there's actually a good reason to do that. And it's got a bunch of different pieces to it. But we want to strengthen international war crimes law. And if we start mixing up various words, it means that they don't have the same meaning that they've had before. And so I mean, what Russia has done is absolutely horrible, and they are classic examples of war crimes, and they can be prosecuted in a war crimes tribunal. And that's probably the way that it's going to move forward. We know that the US State Department is on the ground in Ukraine, helping Ukraine collect evidence of war crimes, and that if there's going to be any kind of congressional action, it'll probably be on that level. I mean, terrorism has a different word. Terrorism is not just any attack on a civilian. And what we've seen in dealing with Iran is that when you decide to take a state entity and accuse it of terrorism, it really complicates diplomacy, not just on the immediate question that you're talking about, but on all the other things that you have to deal with. And so while right now Ukraine is the center of what we're dealing with in Russia, there are all kinds of other issues that we're also going to have to deal with on Russia in the future. And so separating war crimes from terrorism might be a good thing to do, even if we all recognize that these attacks on civilians are horrendous and horrific.
As you can see, there are lots of questions from the audience, so I urge you to keep it to very, a question and very, brief. Yes.
Good evening. I'm Davis Green, an undergrad first year at Columbia College. Thank you guys for your time and insights. I wanted to ask, as we have just recently discussed, the U.S. is a major player in the war in Ukraine, and hearing about how it's impacted so many people, can the U.S. actually compel Ukraine to come to the negotiating table with Russia? Is this something we should do? And if so, how soon, in order to end the war in Ukraine, could this be done? Thank you.
Can and should. Two different questions, but anyone from the panel wants to?
Well, Zelensky has said that, Ukraine, he's made this point again and again, and Biden also has. He says they just reaffirmed it at the G7 or some other European meeting with major states, no decision about Ukraine without Ukraine. And Ukraine's a sovereign state, so I don't think that it's a possibility for the US to compel Ukraine to do anything, nor should it.
Yeah, I just add, I think the Biden administration's handled this exactly right, and that phrase is the perfect phrase. You know, it's up to the Ukrainians to decide what they want, when they want to negotiate, and over what they want to negotiate. And I've heard a lot of American political scientists and commentators talking about compelling Ukraine to make compromises on their sovereign territory. I don't think that would be a good approach to this problem at all, and I think the Biden administration's handled it very well.
Yeah, I don't think the Biden administration is going to do it. It's not clear to me that they can do it, in the sense that, yes, I suppose in principle the United States could say we're cutting off all aid. If some candidates get elected in American domestic politics in the next few years, we might actually do that. That doesn't mean the Ukrainians decide to negotiate and stop shooting. That's their choice. We, short of killing everyone in Ukraine, we lack the physical capacity to force Ukraine to stop fighting. We could, in theory, though we're not very likely to do it, cut off aid, but it's their choice whether they fight or not. And if Zelensky were to decide to go along with some heavy-handed coercive agenda from an American president, he wouldn't be president of Ukraine very long.
That's right. Yeah.
Even if his successor took the same policy, there would be an insurgency in Ukraine. Right? No war ends until both sides agree to stop fighting. If one side still wants to fight, ammunition gets expended, people get killed, and property gets destroyed, the United States is not physically able to compel Ukrainians not to use force to defend their sovereignty, even if we decided we wanted to.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. My name is Seamus Boyle. I'm a first-year MIA student at SIPA. My question is for Professor Christensen in particular, but it's open to everyone. Professor Clement mentioned that for him, the major signal that Putin intended to invade Ukraine was his speech where he mentioned that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, one whole. The Chinese Communist Party says that about Taiwan virtually every day. For you, what would you consider to be an equivalent signal for the CCP to send with regard to a Taiwanese invasion?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I listened to the rhetoric of Xi Jinping. I've listened to the rhetoric of previous Chinese leaders, and I am concerned about some of the rhetoric. And I was in Taiwan in January 2019 when President Xi made a speech about cross-strait relations that went over like a bomb in Taiwan and changed a lot of the political dynamics on the island, in which he claimed that in order to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, he needs to make progress on unification with Taiwan. The mainland is so incredibly unpopular on Taiwan that it's almost impossible to imagine how the mainland, under its current system and its current approach towards Taiwan, could make progress on unification without coercion or the use of force. And that's why I was very concerned about those statements. That's something definitely to watch. On the other side, I don't think the Chinese leadership is reckless, and I think they recognize a lot of the costs that would be involved in actually executing a military campaign against Taiwan. And a big part of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is economic well-being. Also everything in Beijing security policy is about the Chinese Communist Party staying in power. They certainly don't want to lose a conflict, and they don't want to lose their legitimacy at home through economic damage. So I think there is a possibility of continued deterrence, and I think it requires great strength for the United States, great strength for Taiwan and the population and the military, and also moderation. Moderation in Washington about the way our policy is described and how it is executed, and moderation in Taiwan not to unnecessarily provoke Chinese nationalism into a conflict that they otherwise would want to avoid. And that's always been my take on it. If we're strong and moderate, we can prevent this conflict. But I am concerned about the types of statements that you're alluding to. It's very worrisome.
It's very worrisome indeed. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the informative discussion. I'm a senior in Columbia College studying economics and political science. My name is Masu. And I also have a question to Professor Christensen, sort of on the piece of domestic politics in China with relation to the war in Ukraine. So we know that the 20th Party Congress is coming up in Beijing, I think 4 days later, and he is presumably going to secure a third term.
I think he's going to win, yeah. That's where I'm betting on that.
So I'm just curious about sort of the consequences of that on the war in Ukraine, right? On the one hand, we see sort of there might be a more emphasis on sort of economic recovery in China because there has been so much downturn in this year, and that might require sort of more cooperation with the Western countries, at least economically, so that there can be more sort of recovery on that ground, and that might, mean more cooperation with the sort of international order and cooperation. On the other hand, there might, the certain might embolden Xi to sort of be taking a more stance of self-strengthening and a more harsh stance towards Taiwan, so that there be more alliance towards Russia. Yeah. So what will be your prediction for that? And thank you.
So it's a really broad question. I can't answer all aspects of it, Matthew. It's good to see you. You're one of my students. Yeah.
You have a whole semester.
Yeah, they always ask good questions. Yeah. So I just say that I think that he is going to be the successor of himself in the 20th Party Congress. This bunch I can say with some confidence. I could be wrong, but I'd be surprised. I think that he will continue to take a relatively rigid, unflexible stance toward Taiwan, which will be not welcomed on the island, and the chance for any kind of progress on unification through peaceful means, which he claims, like previous leaders, want peaceful unification. There'll be really no prospect of progress in a peaceful way, and that's concerning to me. I do think he'll be concerned about the economy, but as you said, one of his solutions to the economic pressure that he feels that China is under is to increase self-reliance. That is easier said than done, and there are people at Columbia University in the technical fields who know much more about this than I ever will, but you can't just order innovation. You can't just say the government's going to spend more money on innovation through state-owned enterprises. So I think he's going to continue to run into challenges in replacing foreign suppliers of high-tech equipment, things, the fabs for semiconductors and chips. I think that he's going to have difficulty with that. And that will probably temper somewhat his foreign policy towards the United States and and there's supposed to be a summit in November, maybe at G20, maybe President Biden and President Xi will have a summit. I don't expect a great deal to come out of that, but I think it would be a good thing for the two gentlemen to meet and to talk things out.
Tom is an optimist, I can say.
Well, you know, it's a character flaw of mine. That I think that a war between the United States and China is so catastrophic and so damaging to not just both countries, but to the entire world, that if we can't prevent that, it would be a tremendous tragedy and a tremendous disaster. And I believe we can. I think it's getting more difficult, unfortunately.
All right, non-China questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Log. I have a question for our panel who brought up a point about like Donald Trump type of Republican winning being a little bit more soft towards the Russian. There is a study published by economists arguing that there is projections of a lot of Donald Trump-backed candidates are winning in midterms. How is that going to change the trajectory of us relations with the Ukraine and whatnot? I would like to hear.
So Steve, you touched on this domestic political angle in the United States and how that affected, right? The link between domestic politics and foreign policy. What do you have to say in response to this, Steve? What do you predict?
Well, I mean, the Republican Party has been moving away from support for Ukraine pretty consistently since very early spring. Right? The most recent vote, in my recollection, on the Hill on this, the first vote was unanimous. Every voting senator, every voting congressman supported aid. The next vote that was taken, there were 57 House Republicans that voted against aid to Ukraine, 11 Senate Republicans who voted against support for Ukraine.
Right.
If you look across the field of congressional candidates that the Republicans are fielding in the upcoming midterm,
Yes, they are.
right, this is a much Trumpier population than the current population of Republicans in the House. If you then speculate, as some are now doing, that the Republicans will take the House but by a narrow margin, and if the new Republican House leadership takes the same kind of stance that previous Republican House leaderships have, that they will allow no bill to go to the floor that doesn't have a majority of Republicans behind it, you know, and enough Republicans to win the vote without Democratic support, right? An established precedent in Republican leadership on the House side in the past. It's easy to imagine how even a minority of Republicans on the House side who are opposed to aid to Ukraine could make it impossible for the United States to pass legislation continuing to provide support.
And I haven't seen public opinion polls. I haven't had a chance to look at public opinion polls on the issue of aiding Ukraine. Anyone here has information, because that is relevant.
I think a Pew poll just came out, and it's in the same direction. I want to get more specific.
The Republicans
are Republicans voters decreasing support for supporting Ukraine.
Elise, why? Did they say why? Why are these Republicans deciding aid isn't such a good investment? Is
I didn't go to the
financial
original
or
poll,
budget?
so I can't say more than that.
Steve?
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of deep political science arguments about the nature of partisanship in American politics right now. The immediate and unsatisfying answer is it's because Republican leadership has been increasingly taking this position in public statements, and therefore the public is responsive to those
and Tucker Carlson.
And the Republican media sphere has taken this view. I mean, more generally, the populist Republican opinion has seen this as an opportunity to tag support for Ukraine with globalist elites. That they see it as advantageous to juxtapose themselves against, and it's a position the Biden administration holds, and that's an appealing opportunity to take a pound of flesh out of a sitting Democratic president. There are a variety of contributing reasons why the Republican Party has been moving away from support for Ukraine.
So I wanted to say that I served in a Republican administration, and the Republicans I was surrounded by were not these people for the most part.
And we talk about Republicans
it's a new phenomenon.
as if it's one
Just
camp,
point out to people that America First has a history in the United States, and it was a movement in the 1930s that was isolationist, anti-Semitic, and basically pro-Nazi Germany. And that's the phrase that's been used by this new form of Republican that are very foreign to me as a person who served in a Republican administration. So I don't want to give you the wrong impression. This is a movement within the Republican Party, the new Republican Party. It's not a traditional Republican stance.
But it's a majority movement.
It's becoming that because of the primary.
It's already become it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Hulan. I am a first-year MPA-DP student from Mongolia. So my question would be related to Mongolia. Since the Vladimir Putin's announcement on the mobilization, there are some 3,000 Russians fled to Mongolia, but I'm only talking about one of the borders. We have many borders. So in Mongolia, currently, as a former Soviet satellite country, there are pro-Russia generations, but there are younger generations as well. And it's creating a conflict. It has been creating a conflict, but the conflict is inclining toward more extreme activities. So what are the scholars and distinguished experts like yourself looking at this in terms of Mongolia, in between Russia and China?
And thinking about how, yes.
And the consequences as well.
Anyone?
It was in my AOR when I was in the.
There you go.
China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. Right?
I remember. I wanted to give you a chance.
So, you know, I can only do a superficial analysis of the problem, but my strong impression in my 2 visits to Mongolia as a U.S. government official with responsibility for our policy towards Mongolia was that there's a very strong pro-Russian tradition in Mongolia largely based in a fear of China. So right now you have a Mongolia that's between Russia and China. China has been diplomatically kind of sidling up to Russia, but I would hope, and this is a hope more than an analysis, that Mongolia's recent and impressive embrace of democracy would make Mongolians repulsed by Putin's treatment of a bordering democracy, and would maybe temper some of that pro-Russian sentiment about China, particularly at a time when China is diplomatically supporting or at least covering for Russia in this invasion. I would hope, but I don't know the details because I haven't worked on Mongolia for quite a while. But I was really struck by all the Soviet monuments and the Russians. And I was told by people very frankly that this is because no matter what Russia did during the satellite period of Mongolia's authoritarianism, they saved us from China.
Yeah.
If I could add one quick
sure.
point.
Yes,
just recently, there have been conflicts between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan.
Right.
There was a recent Shanghai Cooperation Agreement summit in Uzbekistan, and one of the things I've been picking up is that President Xi has been, in my view, incredibly assertive in describing how China supports the sovereignty of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and I'm thinking, I thought the understanding with the Russians was Russia does security and you can do economics. So I'm a little startled, and perhaps this will feed into the point Tom's making. This could actually elevate the fears, you correct me here, in Mongolia about China.
Right. Also, I would just like to add that the U.S. is the third neighbor of Mongolia, the only third neighbor of Mongolia. And how is that really reflecting to this situation? How is U.S. is taking action to
Let me just, I'm sorry, I have to stop you because there's just so many
Sorry.
people and that
Maybe we can talk more
Exactly.
offline. I would love to
Yes,
talk more.
thank you. That would be great. Okay.
And I'm a big fan of Mongolia.
As am I.
Hi, good evening.
Yes.
My name's Merritt Nowak. I'm a first-year MIA student in the International Security Policy concentration. Dr. Martin made a pretty compelling case for why NATO expansion is not why Russia invaded Ukraine. I'd be interested to know why you think Russia invaded Ukraine if it's not why. Is it, you can't have a democracy growing on your border that has kinship ties to your own citizens, or just this true belief of this shared ethnic history that needs to be protected?
So Peter mentioned, one argument, and then there was the argument that he simply miscalculated. He thought that he had an opportunity. But Kim, do you want to?
Well, despite the fact that Peter and I were disagreeing earlier, I find his argument on this incredibly compelling, and I think it's something that a lot of analysts missed, that Putin has turned into a true ethnic nationalist, and that's happened maybe gradually over time, but it really became very strong pretty recently. That wasn't how he started out being.
I actually like the point you raised in your question. If you go back to 2013, 2014, when Yanukovych was faced with this decision, am I going to go to the EU for associate membership? I'm sorry, the EU, or am I going to go with Putin's EU? And the pressure that Putin exerted and the huge bribe, which led to the decision where Yanukovych said, okay, we're going to go with Putin, which led to Maidan. So I think there is a concern for Putin. Having a democratic, economically healthy Ukraine that grows and prospers leads Russians to say, how come the Ukrainians are so much better off than we are? Is this not an internal stability issue for Putin?
And so, but just to kind of think about it as we political scientists think about it, there is the kind of the deep cause of what really motivated it, and then there is the question of why he decided to do it, the time that he decided to do it, and then there is this issue of miscalculation in terms of opportunity, thinking that the West was not ready to respond, thinking that he could have the military. So that's another kind of a different set of questions. So root cause versus the kind of the thinking about the timing and the scope and the matter by which he was going about it. Yes.
Hi, my name is Zach Ravine. I'm a first-year MIA student. Thank you all for a very interesting evening. I think my question is more for Professor Biddle or Professor Clement, but any are welcome to contribute. Sure. I'm wondering if you attribute the Ukrainian success in repelling the Russian invasion thus far in the war more to material and intelligence support from the U.S. and the West, or to Ukrainian capability that has surprised many?
Well, of course, those aren't mutually exclusive. There's been quite a bit of both. And they've both been important. That said, if the Ukrainian will to resist Russian invasion had been as limited as Putin clearly expected it to be, no amount of American intelligence cooperation would have rescued the country. Right? If Putin's assessment that Ukraine valued its independence so slightly had been true, there's no amount of clever information transfer that Peter's colleagues could provide.
Former colleagues.
Former colleagues.
Former colleagues.
He can't talk about any of that.
Our colleagues never end. Colleaguehood goes on.
They end. Former colleague, yes. Go ahead.
Suffice to say, right, that a minimum requirement for Ukraine remaining independent the way it is now is that Ukrainians were willing to defend their sovereignty the way they have. I mean, obviously, all sorts of assistance from outside has had a powerful role in catalytically enabling Ukrainian will to defend their sovereignty to prevent the Russians from taking over the country. But a necessary precondition for Ukraine remaining sovereign today is their willingness to defend their country.
Thank you.
Karen, can I say something about one of your programs at SEPA? We had a speaker at SEPA in the spring who knows a tremendous amount about the Ukrainian military because he's a U.S. Army officer who trained the Ukrainians. And it's stunning. His talk at the Saltzman Institute has turned out to be exactly right. He said, the Russians, you're going to see on the map, you're going to see growing blobs along the Russian border, and it's going to look really bad for the Ukrainians. And as long as the Ukrainians aren't surrounded by those blobs, they're going to be able to fight their way back in very effectively. And he trained with these people. He trained them for years, and he was very confident that if we supplied weapons, and he pointed out that, you know, military aid is lethal. That's the point, right? If we supply lethal aid, that they will be able to fight back in. And it's pretty much played out exactly like his talk at the Saltzman Institute stated.
That's a great point.
It's quite stunning, and that was a great event. And it's a kind of event that when she was head of Saltzman, she chaired, and that she as head of the SEPA will chair, and it's a great thing.
Yes, it is. Thank you for the plug. Yes.
Hi there. Sorry. Well, thank you for the discussion. It's very interesting. My name is Charlie Sagner. I'm a sophomore in Columbia College. And my question is, having witnessed the failure of a lot of Russian special operations forces in Ukraine and their use as more of a conventional occupying force rather than a direct action component, why do you think that is? And do you see any parallels between that and some of their failures during the first Chechen War, especially given the successes of certain Russian units' deployment during the 2014 invasion?
We happen to have an expert on this.
Well, I guess I would answer in two ways. The first is that, as a general rule, the kind of non-material constraints on Russian military effectiveness that we talked about earlier cause most echelons of Russian military activity to be kind of one rung below what you would expect in the West. So for example, Russian officers typically perform tasks that non-commissioned enlisted soldiers, sergeants in the United States would provide. The Spetsnaz, the Russian special forces, typically perform roles that are less demanding than American special forces would and are more akin to what a good, solid American Army or Marine Corps regular unit would provide. So the first point to make is that it would be less surprising that Russian Spetsnaz didn't turn out to be supermen in light of the general constraints that operate on the Russian military. The second part of the answer, though, is the point that I emphasized earlier, which is they've been put in untenable positions by bad strategic direction. Right? If you deploy 30,000 supermen on the wrong side of the Dnipro River, allow the Ukrainians to drop most of the bridges, put pressure on them to force them to expend their limited ammunition supply, which they can't adequately replace, sooner or later they're going to run out of ammunition. And I don't care if they are Delta Force super soldiers. If you don't have any ammunition, you're not going to judo chop your way to the defense of Kherson. So I mean, my view on the Russian military in general is that they're not the Keystone Cops that they appeared to be in February, right? They're not a world-class military organization at the tactical level, but they're not as bad as they looked. Their central problem, right, the single biggest barrier to Russia taking and holding ground in Ukraine is Vladimir Putin. Right? It's not the manifest training shortcomings of Russian special forces, important though those are.
All right, so we are
Thank you.
nearing the end of this. I want to collect 2 questions from this side and then 1 question from this side. So let's take those the next 2, and if you can just briefly state your question.
Good evening, and thank you all for the great discussion. It seems that...
What is your name and where are you?
Oh, David Eckel. I'm a senior in Columbia College and a member of the Student Scholars Program at Salzman Institute. So it seems that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has put to bed any debate in U.S. political leadership of whether our foreign policy should be aimed at cooperation or competition with our strategic adversaries. And this has been reflected in a lot of President Biden's public remarks and even the national security strategy released earlier today. So my question for any or all of you is whether you think the increasingly conflictual tone of American foreign policy is productive, preparing us for the conflicts of the future in a new global environment, or counterproductive, making inevitable a conflict between superpowers that might otherwise be avoided.
Great question. Yes.
Hello, I'm Emmanuel Hannibal. I'm an MIA student at SIPA, and my question pertains to essentially looking at the recent failures in the wars of choice in the past year, both with Afghanistan, but then particularly with the war in Ukraine. Is it possible to consider these recent events as something that would deter Xi Jinping from invading Taiwan rather than incentivize, given the limited utility of these recent wars of choice?
Okay, so let's start with the first question. Anyone here wants to talk about the foreign policy and conflict? Yep, Peter,
sure.
I see that.
Briefly.
Briefly, yes, very briefly.
Just because we are at a particularly bad point in the bilateral relationship, I don't think that precludes the possibility that there are certain areas where we may find, for very pragmatic reasons, the need to continue discussions. Good example, we have in the past talked with the Russians despite big differences in the conflict in Syria. We've tried to come up with navigation ground rules about managing the conflict so we don't bump into each other. I'd argue that in the area of arms control in particular,
big, yeah.
And I know that I have heard former senior officials who talk about this, Rose Gottmuller being one, that some issues are so big and so timeless that you just need to act on them irrespective of these other day-to-day problems and competitions we have. We saw this during the Reagan era. The evil empire suddenly became a country with whom we could do business. So at different bad points, the other key point, less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were nose to nose, we signed a nuclear test ban treaty. Kennedy and Khrushchev. Who would have thunk? So sometimes you see bigger picture things that matter a whole lot despite your ongoing tensions or competition.
You already talked a lot about the China-Taiwan thing. Is there anything
just
that you
add
wanna...
one thing about it, which is I think that it probably will lead to some caution in Beijing about the prospects of military attack on Taiwan, and I think that caution was already there, so it's intensifying a pre-existing state. It's a very complicated challenge for them. But there's one thing that's different about Taiwan and Ukraine that people should keep in mind, and that is that Taiwan has no equivalent of the Polish border that Ukraine has. So if Taiwan is going to be a military tough nut to crack, it's going to have to get its military equipment in place before the conflict starts, because it's going to be very difficult to resupply an island under a blockade scenario that could be part of an invasion or just a standalone scenario. So Taiwan needs to prepare now in order to pose enough of a challenge to protect itself. And the goal here is not to have a war that Taiwan wins. The goal here is to deter a war from happening in the first place. And to do that, just to return to your earlier point, you have to avoid unnecessary provocations that will cause a war that the mainland doesn't otherwise want.
All right, so let's take two questions from the two of you, and that will be, then we will have one more question and we're going to end. Yes.
Okay. Good evening, I'm Dominika. Thank you for a very insightful panel. The invasion of Ukraine made many other former Soviet countries face fear for their own future, especially knowing Putin's obsession with recreating history that you briefly talked about. I myself come from Lithuania, which is currently, though differently from Ukraine, a NATO member. So my question is, given Putin's great ambition we can see now, do you think that the NATO membership, and especially of the Baltic states, is still a big mental barrier to Putin?
Yep, thank you.
Hi, my name is Greta. I'm a Master of Public Policy, Public Administration at SIPA. I'm also from Lithuania. And my question is, so we're talking territories, we're talking war, like from military perspective, state perspective, but at the end of the day, it's all about people.
It is.
And it seems to me that Ukrainian society, as well as the societies of the countries that were formerly occupied by the Soviet Union or Russian Empire, this war is usually portrayed as a war of Putin. We do see some blame, we do put some blame on the Russian society too. And my question is, how responsible can we hold them? We are aware that there is lots of propaganda in Russia, but the atrocities of today, they were happening also before Putin. They were happening for centuries. And this imperialist sentiment, very strong imperialist sentiment in Russian society was never really challenged, and they never really self-reflected on that. So. Yes, very philosophical question, but maybe you could answer.
Anyone wants to comment very briefly, because we're literally running out of time?
Can I just say in response to the last question, as somebody who was a US citizen during the war against Iraq that I didn't support, I think it's a mistake to blame a whole society for something that's happening. But I think that you're talking about two things that have a really big part of truth in them. That first of all, this pattern of attacking civilians and committing atrocities and war crimes has been part of what Russia, and before it, the Soviet Union has done in just about every war that it's fought. That secondly, it's not just Putin, because if it were just Putin, we wouldn't see the actions happening in the field that we do. And so there is something to the idea that the culture of the society is one that war crimes are not considered something that is to be avoided.
Thank you.
I'll quickly respond to the first question. I do think because Lithuania is in NATO, I think that does give Putin some degree of pause.
Yep.
That's the short answer. We can talk later if you want to go in more detail. It's not a perfect deterrent, but I think it absolutely is on his mind. And given the way the war in Ukraine is going, it makes me more confident that I'm not sure he would be prepared to take on a lot more to chew here.
Yep. Yeah. But this is something we will go back to. There will be an event about the future of NATO and how to think about it. So, yeah, there's questions.
I was struck, he had me read the July 2021 treatise by Putin, and scared me to death. And I before the war started in February, not the war started, but the new invasion started.
That's what we do to each other.
That I was struck at how Lithuania played such a big role in Putin's thinking. Very disturbing. That Lithuania was seen as the source of a lot of the problems that Putin identifies, and I'm glad that Lithuania is in NATO.
Me too. Yeah. All right. Last question of the last two questions. They better be good. Okay, go.
That's a lot of pressure. But my name's Sean Lee, first year MIA student at SIPA. So in the past few weeks, there has been substantial observations of the Russian military purchasing large quantities of iodine solutions and radioactive protective gears. Is there any possibility, now that it's technically annexed territories of eastern province of Ukraine, the Russian forces practice a nuclear experiment in the territory? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vincent. I'm a staff at SIPA. Something that I find interesting is BRICS becoming a superpower in the next 2 decades. So a question that I have is, do you think the Russian-Ukraine conflict will advance the role of BRICS as the leading force for global economic governance reform, or it will serve as a significant distraction from BRICS agenda?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the last sentence?
Yeah, or will this conflict serve as a significant distraction from BRICS agenda?
From what?
BRICS being the Brazil,
Okay.
Russia, India,
Yes.
and
Okay, great.
BRICS?
Thank
Oh, the
you.
BRICS. Oh, the BRICS. Okay.
Yes.
The sound isn't good. Your question was good.
Yeah. Anyone on this?
Just on the iodine question, I think one of the big concerns is that there will be explosion that would hit a nuclear reactor, such as the one in Zaporizhia.
That's very
And that would probably even be more dangerous than a small nuclear explosion if it was an airburst explosion versus something that happened on the ground. And so the reason that they may be taking those iodine pills or preparing for that is not necessarily that Putin's about to launch a nuclear weapon, but that they're concerned that there might be a nuclear accident that happens because of a nuclear reactor getting hit.
Okay. And I think with this, we conclude the event for today. For this evening, I want to thank you for coming, for listening, and also those who join us via live stream. This is, again, one of many events that we at SIPA, the Saltzman Institute, are doing and will continue to do in various aspects. I see a lot of undergrads here. Just that you know, we have the Saltzman Student Scholar Program where you can apply to and hear more and work more closely with the professors here. We have an Emerging Voices program on intelligence and national security that brings women and underrepresented minority to those discussions. And so this is just an invitation. And thank you so much for being with us. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And thank you for the panel. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Okay.